Hi, and welcome to week 11. This week we're going to completely change our ideas on what we're working on. We're going to talk about color and lighting. This is the first kind of step into texturing. We're going to get into textures next week, but this is mainly a modeling course, so I don't want to take too much out of it to learn about texturing and lighting. But I do think it's vital to be able to show off your models with at least some base texture, make them look nice with some lights. All right, so your first assignment that's due on Wednesday is just adding color to an earlier scene. So taking one of your earlier assignments, could be your bedroom scene, the early environment scene, or your Halloween scene that you just did, you're going to add base color to all of the objects into it. These can be Blinn or Lambert, and you will only be adding color. Again, we'll talk about texture next week, and I'll tell you what a Blinn and a Lambert is in a minute. Render a still frame to canvas. This can be a JPEG, TIFF, or Targa. Due Wednesday by 11:59. Now we're going to talk about lighting. And again, I'll go all into lighting, but 3-point lighting is the most common lighting scheme that's used. It's used in photography, film, animation. It is getting really nice highlighting and shadow onto your object. A lot of product photography is done this way. Of course, it is not the only way to light anything, but it's a good place to start. So read about 3-point lighting, and you can also read about all of the different options in Maya for lighting. But again, I'll go over it in a second. And then your due Sunday assignment is adding color and light to your character. So take this opportunity to make any changes that you would like to your high poly character. Then you're going to add base color to your character. This part can be done at a face sub-object level, and you can insert edge loops if needed for the color. After you've colored the model, you will add lighting to show off the model, submit your Maya file, and a rendered still by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. No late assignments accepted. And you did it! Another week done. So, Maya. We're going to just take a cube really quickly, and I will scale it up. This texturing and adding color and all that gets pretty complicated, but again, we're just going to touch the surface of it. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you're wondering if things are possible, but I am going to start as simplified as it gets. Okay? So we're going to right mouse click and hold on our object. Normally we're used to, going into our sub-object modeling here. But if you scroll down, there is assign new material. So I'll let go on that. Now, you'll see favorites, Maya, and Arnold. Arnold is a renderer that Maya recently purchased. It's a little bit more high quality. With the student version, it does have a watermark, but you can create shaders, aka textures, that are made specifically to go with that renderer. We are going to, again, stick to the more basics, and we're going to just do a Blinn or a Lambert. The difference between these two, and you can kind of tell in these little sample walls here, the Blinn is shiny and the Lambert is matte. These are named after their creators, so a Mr. Blinn and a Mr. Lambert. No other real detail into that. So let's start with a Blinn. So I'll just click Blinn. That means this is going to have shine. What that's going to do, and you don't see any change because the default texture is gray, and there was already a default Lambert gray on this. The difference is now I have this Blinn 1 tab. And so if I click into this, I can see my sample ball. We can rename it. So if, I don't know if this was a tree, I don't know why I think of a tree, but this could be tree, tree texture. Don't forget that in Maya, and even with your file names, do not add any spaces, any special characters. Keep it simplified. Try to just use upper and lowercase letters. Type Blinn. If you wanted to change it here, if you're like, oh, I actually wanted a Lambert, you can. I'm going to leave it a Blinn for right now. And then we have color. So we can go in and you'll get this kind of color wheel, and then it's hue, saturation, and value. So pretty similar to Photoshop or something like that. So I could go, you know, if I wanted to pick a purple, and you can use all these sliders and then click done. You can kind of slide through this color now, and it will just adjust the black to white. Well, actually, well, that was weird. Should just keep the color but go kind of from a black to white. Worst case scenario, we can always bring it back, because who doesn't love a nice neon? Transparency. How see-through do you want it to be? Okay. Ambient color and incandescence, we're not going to really worry about for this. These have to deal with how light interacts with it. Bump mapping is something we'll go over next week. So really, actually, a lot of these we'll do next week. So right now, you're just dealing with color and transparency. If you scroll down, specular shading, you can look up here at the sample to see what these do, but it has to deal with changing your highlight. Do you want it to be a strong highlight, a small, sharp highlight, all of that kind of stuff. For the most part, when you're adding textures in, or when you're adding color in Maya, your viewport will show you exactly what it looks like. Sometimes you may want to do a test just to make sure. So we can go over to this second clapboard here. I'm trying to let it pop up for you. It's not going to, but anyway, our render view. Rendering, and you're like, oh no, this is black. Well, remember, we're working in Maya software. And there's our box. Now, this is just the default lighting, so you can see it is a little bit brighter, and that's fine with your scene. The one that's due Wednesday, you don't need to put in any lights, you're just adding color to the objects. Now, let's say I have this cube, and just do this real quick. I have done something like this. Maybe this is my bed or whatever it was. So what we can do is actually edit on a face basis, the color that is. Now, because I deleted my original cube does not mean that my texture is gone. So let's say I wanted this front face to be that purple. I can right mouse click and hold, and instead of assign new material, I can say assign existing material, and then I'll go over to tree texture, even though it isn't even a tree color, but it's still there. So once you've created a texture, it stays in Maya. So Maya will have all of them, which is why it's very important to name them, because they can get lost very easily if you have Blinn 1 to 64 and you're trying to find one. All right, so let's say I want all of these. Let's do more like this. I want all of these faces to be a certain color. I can select those faces, right mouse click and hold, assign new material. I will do a Lambert. I'm going to have these be matte because these are the sheets. There we go. And I can do, let's say we've got green. We'll go back to my tree. Done. I'll call this covers. And then let's say I want these to be a brown. Right mouse click and hold, assign new material. I want them to be a shiny brown, so I'm going to go Blinn. And we'll go over, get a nice brown. Okay? So this is what I mean when you're doing your character. that you can go to the face level to edit your character. Now let's say you wanted to create a pattern on your character's shirt or something like that. Well, you will have a lot more edge loops to work with because that is your high poly model. But I can always, insert edge loop. And now I'm not going to really mold it so much because I don't want to mess around with my model, but now I can go into the faces and assign a different texture. So, and they will stay, they will stay. So if I were to then, let's say, move these vertices, the texture stays inside that face. And we can do a preview. Okay? Now you may be saying, like, I don't really see a lot of highlight and shadow. Well, we haven't added any lights. By default, Maya has default lighting. So use default lighting. The second you create a light, that light overrides the lighting that was originally there. So let's talk about lights. So if you go to Create and Lights, you'll see the lights that we have available to us. The box next to the name of the light is the option box, which we don't necessarily need to do because it will pop up in our attribute editor. But if you want to set it up beforehand, that is great. The cool thing with Maya is that, or with any 3D software, when you are creating the lights, you kind of have to fake it and you get to create it however you want. So let's say at my desk right now, I have the sun shining in the window, it's reflecting off of the desk and hitting my face. In Maya, what we'd need to do is create that original sunlight, then add another light onto the desk to create the bounce lighting, and then add just a very soft light by my face to do that additional kind of fall off bounce lighting. So in general, if you're really trying to light something and light it realistically or light it well, you're going to use more than one light. That being said, one light, you can make it bright enough to light your own scene. So I'm going to start with a directional light. A directional light is our most common dominant light. What this does, and let me zoom in here, this, and you can see it has arrows pointing in the direction. It is light shining from a direction. So the only thing that matters with this is your rotation. I can put this, in front of the bed, behind the bed, whatever I want. It doesn't matter where the icon is because it's light coming from a direction. So there is no start and end point. If I have the light shining this way, it is always just going to be coming and shining at a downward left angle. Okay? So position of a directional light does not matter, only rotation. It is light coming from a direction. This most mimics the sun. You could point it straight down for noon, that kind of stuff. With any light, again, you want to look in your attribute editor. You can change the color of the light. A lot of times I give a slight yellow just because to get a pure white light, it's more common now, but unless you're going for something like that, I would give it a little bit. Intensity is going to be how bright do you want the light to be. Now, it's kind of hard to tell, so we need to do some test renders. Okay? We can see that this is lit because it's coming from a direction, and it's not that bright, right? It's bright on this, but we don't have shadows turned on yet or anything like that. So in this render view window, if you look at this button right here, looks like 2 mountains and a moon with a blue box around it. If you click on that, that saves your image so that we can look back at it again. I'm going to twirl down shadows. Okay, you can see our shadow color. Depending upon what you want, you can make it a gray. Sometimes I add a little bit of a purple to it to complement the yellow light. You don't necessarily need it to actually look purple. Completely up to you. That's a whole color theory lighting discussion for a later time. Then what we're going to use, they have ray trace shadows, but we're going to simplify it a little bit more and just use depth map shadows. Now the resolution starts pretty low, so you're going to see a little bit of pixelation. So see along this edge we're kind of pixelated. I'll save this so we can see the difference. And I'm going to add a ground plane just so you guys can see this cast shadows. And of course now I've changed my view, but that's okay. Alright, so now you can really see these shadows are pixelated. So I'm going to click back on my light and I'm going to crank up the resolution. Now you want to test it because if you just turn it up all the way, that's just adding a lot to your file and it's not necessary. So we're getting closer there. We can see the difference. So a little bit more. All right, and that's good enough for me. Now, if you're like, well, but what about this front face and this front face? Well, that's when you could use additional lighting, lights that we'll talk about in a second, or we can change the angle of our light. Okay. Now the intensity, maybe I think this is actually too bright, so we could turn that down. It's a lot of kind of back and forth getting what you like. All right, so that is the directional light. I talked about kind of supplementing or if you wanted some soft lighting or additional lighting, and a lot of times what we use for that one is an ambient light. Ambient light, little icon, looks like a tiny sun. It's made to be a secondary edition light. That being said, it doesn't have to be, but let's say I'm pretending that there's a lamp clipped, maybe we'll do on the sides of the bed. I'm going to do Command D to duplicate, and we'll put one over there. Maybe for these, I'm going to change the color to be even more yellow. I'm going to make it extreme yellow so that you can see it. I would never really go this extreme. This has shadows as well, but the only option is ray trace shadows. So I'm going to say for now, don't use this if you want shadows attached to it. Okay, this is just to add that little highlight, that little extra something where you want it. So we can see these highlights. We can see everything is very well lit in yellow. And sometimes, you know, if you're like, I couldn't really see that, Jen, make your light, you know, something extreme, like a neon green. I'm going to delete one light so that we can really tell what's happening here. Okay, so it is very clear that this is where the highlight is of it, but it's making everything green. So we can really turn down that intensity, and maybe I want to up the intensity of my directional light. Still looking pretty green, making additional things green. Okay, so now we can't really see it. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. Okay, I can delete this one and we can see if I just did an ambient light, it make it almost to white. There we go. No shadows, but we can see a nice highlight. Ambient light. Now we have point light. So point light looks fairly similar to an ambient light, but this is a more powerful light. That being said, you can make the intensity just as powerful, but this is more commonly used. It is light coming from a point in space. So just like the icon looks like, we have that point and little lines of light shining in all directions. A lot of times I would use this for a light bulb because it's going to all come, we know exactly where the light is positioned. So for instance, if I were to place it over the bed, and same thing always applies. We can change the color, we can change the intensity. For this one, you could add light effects. We're not getting into that, but you can add kind of like a fog. Ray trace shadows, we're going to use depth map shadows. I'm going to turn them up a little bit, and let's check it out. Light coming from a point in space. Now, don't forget, I don't know if I can show you both these at the same time. Jen, this seems way more cut off than in my image here. Well, we talked about this with rendering, but you want to turn on your resolution gate. That's this gray square with the blue ball in it. That will show you exactly what your camera sees. You can go into your render settings to make sure if we want to do an HD, 1920, 1080. Now, I would recommend you wait to turn this up because we saw how quickly it was going before, and it still might go fairly quickly. Nope. It's going to take a lot longer. Right? Even with just that little bit, it's going to take a lot longer to render. That being said, it's a much nicer render, and it's the high definition pixel resolution that we're looking for. So I would do a bunch of tests first, and then when you have your lighting and colors set up, then you can turn it up to do your render. Now we can see this is casting shadows in all directions because the light is central and casting that way. It's okay if you want, if you're like, man, I want the shadows to be softer, but I don't want to move the lighting, you can duplicate the light and turn off the shadows on the second one. For the sake of our lecture, we'll keep the dimensions the same, but turn it down a little bit. So, light coming from a point in space. Spotlight. This is similar to a flashlight. You can see we have the point in the back and then this circular opening with an arrow. This one, your location, rotation, everything matters. Well, let me just start this up here. It matters to an extent because we can edit some stuff here. I'll show you what it looks like just as a default. So here's our light. It is a circle, just kind of like a flashlight would be. You're not seeing the light between where I've positioned the light and the object. You're only seeing where it hits on our model. So you can pull the light back, which would look something like this to make it larger. Or, oh, and you can always hit escape on your keyboard if you don't want to wait for it to finish rendering. But we've got these options down here. Your cone angle. How big do you want that cone to be? So I can make the cone wider there. I don't think it needs to be quite that large. And you can look up here and it tells you the light shape and your sample. The penumbra is how much feathering do you want on that edge of your light, or do you want it to be a very hard edge? And then the drop off is how far away from that edge do you want the light to actually be. So we can get some real nice feathering. Let me go up. Okay, so we can see this feather out. That's what those are all editing. Again, change the color, the intensity, and turn on your depth map shadows. Now, an area light is kind of like a fluorescent ceiling light, if you will. This one has a square, which is where the light is coming from, and then this line indicating where it is pointing. This one is more commonly used with effects as we get more detailed with volume, but shadows, now this is still pretty dark, right? Well, that has to do with the distance the light is away. So if we bring our area light closer, probably should have made my render even smaller, but we can see now we're getting more of a highlight. So you can see kind of how this would be also used with other ones. So you could have multiple area lights, kind of like we would on the ceiling, or you could put it in combination with any of the other lights. You will read about 3-point lighting. It's up to you what type of light you want to use for each of the lights. I just have the sample here. Your object, you're going to start with your key light, which is going to be your main light, and then adding on the fill light, and then finally the backlight. Your camera would be somewhere around here, pointing to the object. It really just adds that nice highlight and that nice shadow to your model. Again, making them look even further 3D. All right, so we have base colors, setting up lighting for your character. If you'd like to play around with lighting in your scene, you're welcome to, but you definitely do not need to. So base colors, adding lights to your character to really show it off, and then rendering a high quality, high definition still. All right, so let me know if you have any questions and have a wonderful week.